All right, looks like we are live, and I want to welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny, and I am your host for this evening's program on creation versus evolution. On Standing for Truth, we defend the truth of biblical creation. And as always, it is a privilege to have Dr. Grady McMurtry here with us for questions and answers on all things origins. It's great having somebody as knowledgeable and well-rounded on these topics as Dr. Grady is to answer questions on the age of the earth, creation, evolution, the Genesis flood, and more. And so, Dr. Grady, as always, thank you so much for your time. And you've been a true blessing to this channel and just helping us defend the truth of biblical creation.
Well, Don, it's good to see you again. And of course, I defend biblical creation as well as scientifically creation.
Amen. Amen. And Dr. Grady, you are a fan favorite because when you're here, you answer questions on, and we were talking about this before we went live, biology, genetics, geology, paleontology, whatever it is, you are equipped to answer the question. So I'm looking forward to this. I know the audience is as well. But before we get into the questions themselves, I do want to give our guest, Dr. Grady, a formal introduction. Now, this is typically where I hand it over to my award-winning co-host, Sam, to give the proper introduction, but he is, because of work, running late, but he should join us probably at the hour mark. And so stay tuned for that. And let me go through a brief introduction. So Dr. Grady S. McMurtry is an American Christian apologist who focuses on the areas of biblical creation and creation science. Dr. McMurtry earned his BS from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, an MS from the State University of New York, Syracuse, and a doctorate of divinity from the School of Theology, Columbus, Georgia. He is a regent and adjunct professor of the School of Theology, Columbus, Georgia, life member of the Creation Research Society, and a member of the Mensa Society. McMurtry was an evolutionist for 20 years, a theistic evolutionist for 1.5 years, and has been a biblical creationist for 35 years. He has made hundreds of appearances on radio and television, lectured in universities, colleges, and schools, and he has spoken in churches worldwide. In addition, Dr. McMurtry is on the recommended speaker lists of national, educational, and ministerial organizations. Lastly, he is the author of many articles, magazine and newspaper articles in the United States and abroad. To the audience, I've also got Dr. Grady's relevant links to his website and YouTube channel in the description box for people to check out. Now, with that, Dr. Grady, this isn't your first time here. You're definitely no stranger to this channel. As a matter of fact, you've joined us for several comprehensive question and answer programs. As we are always gaining new supporters and subscribers, I'd like, if you were to be able to, for anyone unfamiliar with you, basically, please take us on a journey through how you became a creationist and ultimately came to reject evolution as the best scientific model for origins.
I'd be happy to do that. I was kind of smiling when you were reading that bio. You know, that's a very old bio. You're 14 years behind. I'll have to get you a new one. I've been speaking on the subject now for 49 years. I'm a lifetime member of Mensa. I'm also a lifetime member of Intertel too now. But I was born in San Francisco, California, if you can believe it. Grew up on the campus at Cal Berkeley because my father was a professor there. He was also secretary of the president one time before we left California. And grew up as an evolutionist. Grew up being taught nothing but evolution, believing that evolution was true. And because I was never taught that there was a scientific valid alternative to it. However, I would go on to earn my degrees with honors in evolutionary science. However, at the age of 27, in a search for truth, which is what any good scientist should do, I then asked myself the question about whether Christ was telling the truth or not. You know, I had been around Christianity all my life, even though I didn't believe in it. And I did a scholastic search for 6 months on the question, was Jesus telling the truth or was he not? Because obviously, if he was not, I needed to move on to other things. But if he was, I needed to accept it just to maintain intellectual honesty. And so at the end of 6 months of a diligent search, I came to the conclusion that Jesus was, in fact, telling the truth. And therefore, I had to accept him as Lord and Savior. There was no choice. But that just made me a saved evolutionist. I'm smart enough to realize that's a problem. And so for 16 more months, I studied the issue. Did God use some kind of an evolutionary process to create what we see around us today? Or is the Bible telling the exact truth about a recent creation, roughly 6,000 years ago, whole, complete, perfect at one time? And that because of human sin, it's in a process of decay. And after 16 months, I came to the realization that science that I had learned and taught others was not true. There is no scientific truth to evolution whatsoever. I like your opening. It's a fairy tale for adults. It's a house of cards. You remove one card, the whole thing falls. The last question I asked myself, though, is the one that really I'd like to challenge everybody with was, at the end of 16 months, I simply asked myself the question, could the law of gravity have ever evolved? Could gravity have been anything less than it is? And the obvious answer is no. And therefore, it had to be created. It could not have come from something less to become what it is. And instantaneously, you realize the same thing is true of all the other scientific laws, not just gravity, but motion, genetics, all of them. And from that point on, I started teaching about creation, the truth of it, both biblically and scientifically. And I've been doing that for 49 years. I will leave later this week for a mission trip, 3 weeks in Brazil and Bolivia. So I'm a full-time teaching creation missionary, doing both foreign work as well as domestic.
Well, Dr. Grady, it is a blessing that you, through your journey, came out of the false science of evolutionism and to the truth of biblical creation and creation science as you defend both. And as always, prayers for your ongoing ministry work. That is awesome, Dr. Grady, and I really appreciate it. So to the audience, keep doing what you're doing. Just tag me with your questions. I am saving them to the side, and I will make sure we get to all of them. But firstly, I want to go over a few of my own questions, and they are based on dismantling evidence for evolution, essentially. And so my first question, before I get to it, I'll go over a little context. So BioLogos, they are a well-known theistic evolutionism organization. Many people, they look to this organization to provide them evidence for evolution or common descent. Therefore, I thought it'd be a good idea to check the BioLogos website out and see what they believe is essentially the best evidence for common descent. And so I have an article here that I can post in the chat and also in the description box. And this is from the BioLogos website. And they cover several lines of evidence for why they believe all life, including plants and animals, Dr. Grady, are related through common ancestry. And so the first line of evidence that they point to is forms and structures, or in other words, homologous patterns observed in the biological world. And so my question for you, Dr. Grady, are shared forms and structures good evidence for evolution? And if not, why not?
Well, no, just to be perfectly honest, the evidence would say that there are two valid ways of looking at this. At one time, of course, we would say evolution was true because we would say we all came from a common ancestor. But the same evidence is true if we come from a common designer. And that's what I would take the position. BioLogos is a most unfortunate organization, deceiving Christians into believing that you can have evolution and compromise it into the Bible. But when you take a look at homology, you see that you have a designer, creator God who can take one structure and, as any good, perfect engineer can do, use it, modify it for many different things. And I would simply say, take a look at your hands. You know, the pendactyl pattern that we have here are 5 digits. It's ubiquitous throughout nature. And why do we have this? Well, it's maybe similar with apes. It's similar with pandas. But if you take a look at it, the bones are exactly the same bones that are in the leg of a horse or the wing of a bat, the wing of a bird, or the flipper of a whale. And why? because you have a common designer who could take one really good design and modify it for many different things. And if I can sort of summarize it, the design of the human hand, or the pendactyl pattern, period, is designed specifically to grasp something, whatever it is. So our hands can grasp a glass, but a bird's wing grasps air. A horse's leg grasps the ground. Same thing with a bat's wing, it grasps air. And so it's one really good design. And the only difference between them is the size and length of the bones, but they're the same bones. And so while you can sort of justify in your own mind, if you want to make that compromise, that we have a common ancestor using that argument, I would have the opposite argument. It shows a common designer.
Amen. Well said. Human designers build in homologous patterns. And so why wouldn't God design in homologous patterns as we see in the biological world?
I've taught in universities all over the world, and I've taught in some engineering universities at the high end, particularly over in Russia. And I have had scientist emeritus professors there in engineering universities that absolutely agree with me. They believe in creation. They don't accept evolution because it's bad science. And they were very delighted when I was talking to their students and showing them the concepts of a designer God, again, using one really good design, but modifying it for many different purposes.
Would you argue that the line of evidence from homology is more or less agnostic to the creation versus evolution debate? Because your evolutionist is going to say that these shared structures and forms are basically inherited through common ancestors. But the creationists like you and I, we would say they're there due to common design. And so both models have their explanations for it.
Well, that sounds good on paper until you start looking at it scientifically. So let's take a look at this idea of a common, ancestor. Well, that would mean that, of course, different life forms had to evolve the same answer many different times. But that's not the key issue. The key issue is genetic entropy. The whole concepts of evolution, that the simple becomes more complex over time, is a vacuous argument. What we see in genetics is that we are losing genetic information over time. We're not gaining it. And so, first of all, you couldn't have a common ancestor to begin with.
That's a good argument. So essentially what you're saying is when we look at the genotype, which is just the genetic content of the organism, there is no valid mechanism for forward evolution. And so the homology...
Even Darwin said that he recognized the gaps in between organisms, and we know of more gaps now than he did. And so simply lining things up by size and shape, or saying that these things have homologous structures, is not a good argument.
And this genetic entropy you talk about, deleterious mutation accumulation, does that not put shelf lives on genomes?
Well, of course it does, because what it shows you is that the genome started perfect to begin with and are becoming more and more corrupted, more and more damaged, more and more ruined. I mean, there are a variety of words that you could use to describe it. But the fact of the matter is that we are losing genetic information. We're not gaining it. And that is, as a matter of fact, I find it kind of interesting. You mentioned biologos, and I don't want to give them more time than they ought to have, but one of the founding members of that was involved with the Human Genome Project that came out in April of 2003. And this is one reason why he became a, quote, Christian, unquote, and trying to compromise evolution with the Bible. But the fact of the matter is that from his time until now, we've added so much information about genetic entropy that I really wonder how he could possibly still have the same position. Again, genetic entropy sets a clock that you start with perfection and you decay until it becomes useless. And so human beings and all other creatures right now are reaching a deadline. We are becoming extinct slowly and gradually over time. Now, I can't tell you exactly which generation that's going to occur in, and it would be different for other people. We are today basically the 250th generation since creation. We are today accumulating 1 to 2%, as you say, deleterious mutations per generation. We're going downhill fast. And what happens is that eventually we become sterile. When you become sterile, you become extinct.
And the problem, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Grady,
Excuse me.
the majority of these nearly neutral, I guess, as people would call them, mutations, they are not seen in any way. And so they just build up unchecked, they spread throughout the population, and they result in genetic sickness rather than fish to fisherman evolution.
Well, of course, you can get genetic diseases such as hemophilia and others, sickle cell anemia. These come from, again, mutations of the original perfect information. But there is no such thing really as a neutral mutation. Today they call them functional mutations. And I know there are people who will argue that there are some neutral mutations. But ultimately, they all become downhill. They all break over time. So you might have a mutation that had no net effect in this generation, but ultimately it's going to break down in the next generation or in the next generation. Nothing gets better by random chance.
Is it therefore that universal common descent, Dr. Grady, is simply a presupposition imposed on the genetic data rather than a conclusion drawn from the genetic data itself?
Again, I have stipulated before in the program, as you know, evolution and evolutionary concepts are a religion, they're not science. Everything in science contradicts evolutionary thinking, regardless of where you are, whether it's probability and logic, whether it's science, it doesn't matter. Everything in science, because the second law of thermodynamics applied to all systems, whether natural or biological, etc. This is what happens. You know, the only way you'll get an increase in intelligence or complexity is by the input of a greater intelligence. And that's why God started it all perfect. And human sin, of course, started the corruption process. Initially, very slow, very gradually, just a little mistake here, a little mistake there that was not terribly significant, which is why people used to live to be 900 years old. However, like a snowball going downhill, nothing fixes them permanently. Now, of course, we have found that there are 7 mechanisms in our DNA that correct the minor mistakes that are made every day. I mean, in every cell of your body, you've got 1,000 to 1,000,000 mutations per day. And God knew that ahead of time because of human sin. And so he put mechanisms in our DNA to correct the minor mistakes. And so that's why we're still alive, or otherwise we'd already be dead. However, they will not correct major mistakes, again, such as sickle cell anemia or hemophilia. And therefore, over a long period of time, things are just getting worse and worse.
And from my understanding, Dr. Grady, the information for those DNA repair enzymes, they're encoded in the DNA itself. And
Correct.
so is there not a chicken and egg problem, therefore, for the evolutionists? What came first, the DNA or the DNA repair enzymes?
Well, see, that's just it. If you have enough faith to believe that DNA, which is the most complex, molecule in the universe, could come about by random chance, which stretches all credulity, then you would also have to accept that at the same time, by random chance, mechanisms evolved that would correct mistakes in the DNA itself, which points out it's impossible. You know, the whole thing simply breaks down when you look at it from a biochemical, biological standpoint. The arguments don't hold. They are simply fiction. And they can, of course, convert or convince those who willingly want to be deceived. But a genuine scientist would not accept them at all.
Amen. Like you said, we have millions of DNA breaks or lesions, as I've read in these technical papers, in a cell per day. We have trillions of cells. And so thank God that he created or designed organisms with front-loaded DNA repair enzymes, or else we'd probably go extinct after a couple generations, Dr. Grady.
And this shows God's pre-knowledge, his foreknowledge.
Right.
He knew once human sin occurred that genetic information would start to be lost. He knew that if that happened for very long, we wouldn't be here for very long. So he put the corrective mechanisms for the minor mistakes. And of course, there's some real interesting things about that we could talk about. But he put them there in his foreknowledge, knowing that we would need them to survive.
Amen. And as you pointed out with genetic entropy, and still in light of those amazingly sophisticated DNA repair enzymes, many mutations are passed on. They still get through those design mechanisms.
Well, that's just it. Major mistakes are not going to be corrected by these small little engines, as I might say to them. These are little engines that go up and down the DNA, correcting various kinds of mistakes every day. And this is the only reason that we're still alive. And the good news is that most of those mistakes are made in the non-reproductive cells. But still, if we didn't correct them, we would suffer tremendously and die young.
Amen. Dr. Grady. A couple audience questions and comments. We'll start with this. Sandy C. She says, "Hi, Donnie. Great to see you have Dr. Grady McMurtry back again. He's an inspiration." So, Dr. Grady, you're an inspiration to many. And I want to remind everyone in the audience, if you check the description box, firstly, Dr. Grady, going back almost 5 years ago, you were one of our first interviews on this channel. Yeah. And so that's a privilege. And you've been here about 5 more times since then for some really extensive Q&A. So I do want to encourage people to check those out. The next comment comes in from an evolutionary population geneticist in the chat, Zach Hancock. And so he points to, I'm assuming as a way to add new information, neo-functionalization. If I understand that correctly, he's trying to say that a gene duplication can basically add a new gene, and then that new gene can experience novel mutations that are hopefully beneficial enough to lead to true novelty. Do you have any thoughts on that mechanism, Dr. Grady?
Well, again, we would have to go back into a long discussion on this, but I would say that this argument, again, is a false argument. He's trying to convince himself, perhaps. But mutations always take the original information and corrupt them, regardless of what that is. Now, there are mutations that are attributed to giving some benefit, such as, and I'll use sickle cell anemia, most people are familiar with it. This is a mutation which supposedly prevents people from getting malaria. I can assure you, though, that anybody who has that disease would, in fact, much prefer malaria. Sickle cell anemia is an extremely painful process where the normal blood cells, which look a little bit like a donut with a skin in the middle, they become deformed. And when they become deformed, they get clogged into the capillaries. This causes a lack of oxygen and nutrients. It causes tremendous pain, etc. So while you might say that there's the benefit of not getting malaria, you have to also realize that it is because of the loss of the information of the correct cell. And so the deforming of the cell is a loss of proper information, the original perfect information. Now, in terms of mutations providing something that is quote unquote novel, take a good look, because while you might have mutations that produce some new variant, they are never better. They are always worse.
So basically, sickle cell anemia, if we just look at the phenotype, we could erroneously believe that this is truly beneficial, because as you pointed out, those with sickle cell anemia are resistant to malaria. But genotypically, or like I like to say, if we look under the hood, Dr. Grady, what's going on? And it's due to a deformed hemoglobin, essentially a broken cell.
That's just it. I like to point out that mutations, again, corrupt, destroy, damage previously perfect information, regardless of what we have. And in the case of sickle cell anemia, the cells become deformed because the perfect cell information has been corrupted. And so what happens when people have some particular one specific benefit, it's because of the loss of information. It's not because of the gain of information. The cells didn't become better, they became worse. And so when we take a look at, for instance, disease control of any kind, I don't care whether it's malaria or anything else, particularly when we take a look at microbiology, the immunization of antibiotic materials, what happens is something becomes resistant to the antibiotic that we have. Not because the bacteria or virus, whatever, became better. It's because it became worse. My own mother, and I take this rather personally, my own mother died from what's referred to many times as a superbug. She had a perfectly valid operation, replaced 2 heart valves, became septic 2 weeks later, and perished. Now, why? These are not superbugs. They are defective bugs, and I'm talking bugs in the very generic form. But what happens is that each organism has a variety of places that we can attack it. We can attack it at a cell receptor on the outside. We can attack an enzyme on the inside, not getting real technical here. But what happens? Because there's a mutation, the cell receptor on the outside wall or the enzyme on the inside has a mutation where it becomes worse, not better. We're taking the original perfect enzyme or perfect cell receptor, and it becomes broken. And because of that, our antibiotic can no longer kill this organism. However, when you take a look at the organism and compare it to those of the same species, variety, etc., then the broken one is metabolizing slower, it's reproducing slower. The problem is that we can't kill it, and that's when it overwhelms our body and we die. That's what happened with my mother. And so it's because the organism became defective, not because it became bigger, better, faster, or smarter.
I find that with the evolutionists, and I think you're hitting the nail on its head with this, Dr. Grady, because they'll typically, when it comes to so-called beneficial mutations, they will exclusively identify them based on the physical characteristics, resistance to malaria, resistance to antibiotics, but they pay very little attention to what's going on within the genetic systems. As you're pointing out, it's typically degrading, it's reductive, we're looking at broken down pre-existing systems. That's not going to result in evolution.
It is not evolution at all. And remember that ultimately, an organism survives only because information was pre-existing. No new beneficial or more intelligent information has been added. It is simply because of a defect in copying the previously existing perfect information that allows it to survive. But again, it metabolizes slower, it reproduces slower. And what's interesting too is if you will add it back into, let's say, a petri dish of bacteria, if you add the defective ones that we can't kill with an antibiotic, a petri dish with the same organism that's not broken, then the perfect ones will overwhelm the broken ones after only a few generations.
Usually a follow-up question or argument from the evolutionist, Dr. Grady, especially in debates, is they will ask, what do you mean by information, or how can we define information to be able to tell if it's a loss or if it's a gain?
Well, again, today, of course, we can tell whether it's a loss or a gain, and we can see that it is a loss, as again, mistakes accumulate over time, and the major mistakes are not corrected. Therefore, we are accumulating these major mistakes over time, and the snowball, again, more and more mistakes, generation to generation. The wonder is that we even exist today, and that's by God's grace. Again, we talked about the enzymes to correct various things. But the fact of the matter is we continue to find more and more of these defects, every generation being added. Today, we're adding roughly 60 to 100 new mistakes, new errors, new mutations per generation. And again, that amounts to roughly 1 to 2% of our DNA per generation.
So basically, because it's a mistake or a typographical error in a text, let's say in a book, that is degrading the message and therefore equates to a loss of information in some way.
Right. Now, see, the evolutionist genesis you just had on, you can have the accidental duplication of previously existing information, so that people don't realize this, but no human being has necessarily the exact same DNA.
Right.
Because we can vary by as much as 2,000 genes, that is to say 1,000 more or 1,000 less, and still be human. So one person has say 5 genes for a particular thing, another might have only 3. And yet they both function perfectly well because you only need 3 to get along. And so whether you have 4 or 5 is kind of an irrelevant thing. It's a built-in redundancy, perhaps. Now, if taken to an extreme, that could be a problem because, again, you could produce too much of something that would then be deleterious. But the fact of the matter is that humans don't share the exact same number of DNA. Again, this is across the entire human population. So we have roughly 22, 23,000 genes, maybe as few as 21,000 genes, and yet still be perfectly human. And we now find that much of the other genetic information is doing work that's not just the genes. As a matter of fact, today we can say, genetically speaking, that there's no such thing as a DNA component that doesn't provide some benefit, whether it's a pseudogene or anything else. And so we can change the position of a gene within the genome. We can duplicate it more than normal or lose some. But again, it's not new information making us bigger, better, faster, smarter human beings. We are deteriorating. And over time, there's a 100% loss.
And I'm trying to find that comment again, neo-functionalization. If I took, just in the form of an analogy, maybe to help the audience understand, if I took a book and then made a whole copy of the same book, and then in the additional copy of the book I already own, I start introducing typographical errors, isn't that just resulting in a more degraded copy of the original book? It's still ultimately degrading.
I'm sure, Donnie, you've also seen if you have people who take away letters or scramble up words in the middle, that you can still understand the language if you have the first and last letter in the correct place. You know, we have a word that has 6 letters in it, and you mess up a couple because we know what the word is. As long as the first and last letter are in the right place, we can still make out the message, even though it's been scrambled up. But again, that's a mutation, a copying error. It's a mistake in copying the previously existing information. And so mutations, while they may not be deleterious in this generation, ultimately in long term, they continue to add up more and more and more over time. And things are not getting better, they're getting worse.
Especially as they move around and spread throughout the population, they grow to such an extensive genetic load. I like what you said. It's amazing that we can even speak to each other right now, hear and listen, since we are a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of Adam, basically going right back to Adam, who had that perfect genome.
And that's what I talk about. We today, each individual one of us is approximately the 250th copy from the original. Now, a little more, a little less, depending upon the individual, of course. We can't recreate that entirely. However, there's no corrective mechanism that will get us back to the original outside of the input from God himself. We are accumulating errors over time. Ultimately, this will, as I say, lead to sterilization and ultimately to extinction. I mean, that's where it's going. Now, I can't tell you whether that's another 3 generations, 10 generations, 20 generations, but that's the ultimate point of it. It is one and only one of the scientific reasons that we can prove that humans will not be here much longer, that the Lord is coming back soon, not because we're forcing him to in some way, but simply because the Bible says we're going to be here to greet him when he returns, not necessarily you or I, but humans. And if this process were to continue, the genetic entropy or the continued decay of the Earth's magnetic field or various other things, humans would not be here, and no one would be here to greet the Lord on his return. Therefore, he must be coming back, and I'll just simply use the word soon.
Amen. Dr. Grady, great stuff. So a follow-up from Zach Hancock, appreciate it. He says, so could one of those extra copies gain a new function since they are redundant and free to mutate?
Yeah, and they're free to mutate, but you don't seem to be grasping this, Zach. If you start with perfect information, you can duplicate it, but you can't make it better. You cannot copy something more perfectly. You can either copy it perfectly or imperfectly, but you can't copy it more perfectly. And therefore, the information becomes destroyed over time, ultimately and finally. And so your faith in mutations is ill-placed.
And the evolutionist, based on the accumulating, or I should say growing genetic load, the last time I checked, the mutation rate is somewhere between 100 and 200 new mutations per person per generation. And so the evolutionists would require, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Grady, thousands of truly beneficial mutations to counterbalance the damage. And yet they struggle to provide even one. And we can just debate about those all day.
Well, I was about to say, we'll have a continuous argument over this if you simply rely on faith that mutations can produce something novel and new and beneficial, because they don't. Gene either does what it does or it doesn't. And what's more marvelous than that is that when we take a look at genetics today, once Crick and Watson found the DNA molecule back in 53, we found tremendous information. Now, information is coded material that provides a beneficial thing. And we found the DNA molecule. That was a marvelous thing. We started to realize how absolutely wonderfully complex it was, how much information could be compacted into such a small space. I mean, if you want a computer that has storage space, you have to go to the molecular level. Now, that was marvelous. And then, of course, 50 years later, we find out that there's epigenetic information. The histones wrapped around the DNA molecule that open and close and control the molecule. So that means there's a level of intelligence above the information level. Recently, we have found that there's a third level of intelligence in the DNA. And it is a total misnomer, and I hope that people are listening to this. It is a misnomer that one gene controls one function. Usually it's a combination, but one gene can do and make as many as 5 different proteins and does it on demand. Now that again requires an intelligence to tell the molecule when to make this protein and when to make that protein. And the human DNA is more complex than the DNA of other creatures. Now, there are many creatures that have more chromosomes than we do, but that's not the issue. There are creatures that have more genes than we do. That's not the problem. The problem is that human DNA is capable of doing far more than the others because it can literally be programmed by God to make all these different proteins and then do that on demand so that you don't make too much of one at a time because the body needs this now and that then. And so the idea that this novel, mutation is going to occur and be beneficial is, again, it's vacuous. It's not true.
Excellent point, Dr. Grady. 40 years ago, you can see in these biology textbooks, the paradigm was one gene, one protein, one function. As you put it now, it's actually called protein moonlighting. A single nuclear DNA protein can have multiple functions.
Well, and like I say, up to 5, do it on demand. And,
right.
And so what tells it to do that? There has to be an intelligence involved.
And with epigenetics, we have, as you've pointed out, we have an abundance of genetic switches. I've read millions of genetic switches in our DNA that are just waiting to be turned on through an environmental cue. And is that not evidence for forward thinking?
Well, as I said, today we now know there is no such thing as junk DNA. These evolutionary geneticists want to say that 80% of our DNA is useless and left over from previous times, and it's been destroyed. That's true, but we still have the useful stuff where the useful stuff has evolved into existence, but we still have all this junk left over. Well, it's not true. Today we now know there's no such thing as junk DNA. Pseudogenes have a purpose. Various retroviruses, they have a purpose, and that often they're working together with more than one gene with these other things to accomplish whatever task is needed. And so this shows divine intelligence.
Amen. And biologos, to not give them too much fame here, they look to pseudogenes, as you've pointed out, and endogenous retroviruses as two of the most irrefutable lines of evidence for evolution. But as you're pointing out, they have important functional roles. I understand ERVs are functional in the embryo, Dr. Grady.
We would refute biologos entirely. They are, we are not going to judge them in terms of their salvation, period. But we can judge that what they're teaching is terrible information. It's not true biblically, and it's not true scientifically either.
So basically, especially for the audience context, evolutionists, they'll look to what's called shared genetic mistakes between humans and chimpanzees. They refer to them as pseudogenes. And so they argue those mistakes or pseudogenes were inherited from a common ancestor in the past. Are you saying that those are not necessarily genetic mistakes, but functional DNA elements, Dr. Grady?
Well, first of all, whether it's a chimpanzee or a human, the DNA is functional. That's not the issue.
Right.
Let's do something that will really upset him. There are evolutionists who want to teach, deceive people into believing that, say, chimpanzees or apes in general share 96 to 99% the same DNA as a human. That's why we have a similarity of appearance. Again, the argument by homology. But I want to point out that today we now know that humans and chimpanzees only share 70% the same DNA. But we also share 70% the same DNA with the sea sponge. So what makes us human versus a sea sponge? Why are we 30% different than apes if we have such a similarity of appearance? Now, think about this for a second. That is 900 million DNA differences between people and chimps. I have this collection. I love collecting them of people who try to show that humans evolved from apes, and they will show you all of the Australopithecines in between, you know, Lucy and all the others. But I grew up on the campus of Cal Berkeley. Now, I show one of these, representations of how apes became people, and it shows that the chimpanzees separated from the human line 6 million supposed years ago. But more recently, in 2013, they published, oh no, it was 13 million years ago. You see, the more differences they're finding, the farther back they're trying to push the separation, because otherwise their religion doesn't work.
Right. And they discovered, and they still lack an answer, that the Y chromosome, which, as you know, Dr. Grady, is uniparentally inherited DNA. It's passed down on the father's side. They discovered that the human Y chromosome and chimpanzee Y chromosomes are only about 35% the same.
Actually, it's worse than that. They're more than 50% different. And this, again, is another reason that, you know, when you take a look at the male female, you take a look at the Y chromosome of male chimpanzees and also female chimpanzees compared to humans. I don't mean to discredit the ladies here, but ladies, you're about 30% different, but men are more than 58% different. So again, you can't make this work. And the idea that somehow or another there's this folding or separation, et cetera, if you'll take a look at the actual locations they're talking about, it's not true. We can prove that scientifically. And so apes and humans are not related directly, having evolved one from the other. They have a common designer, but they don't have a common DNA. You cannot compare creatures by looking at the DNA. And I'll point out again, we're 60% the same as a chicken. You're 50% the same as a banana. So you can't line up organisms with that kind of a comparison. It doesn't work.
I like to say it's the differences that make all the differences. And the evolutionist wants to only look at the similarities. But even in the similar genetic regions, Dr. Grady, let's say between humans and chimpanzees, there are differences in the way those genes are expressed or regulated. So there's even differences there.
Well, they're also on different chromosomes. I mean, they're located in different places on the chromosomes. there are so many differences that they ought to realize that they're again not evolving one from the other. That there's a divine God who created the DNA that allows us to be what we are, humans or Australopithecines or apes, chimpanzees, whatever, and does use similar structures for similar purposes. But the information, it does not line up for the purposes of evolution. It lines up in such a way that it refutes evolution.
Amen. So many great points, Dr. Grady. The sections of the genome that don't code for proteins, which the evolutionist considers mostly junk DNA, those regions regulate the protein coding regions of the genome.
Well, again, we've known for 10 years, that their argument is not true. I'd like to know when science teachers, evolutionist science teachers, evolutionary researchers are going to catch up with the modern research itself. They're 10, 20, 30 years behind. The sad news is that many science teachers, and especially, of course, those that are evolutionists, but that they go to schools to learn how to teach, and they find out a certain amount about their area, like being a history teacher or being a science teacher, but they don't stay up with the literature, and they simply repeat the errors of 5, 10, 20 years ago.
Right. These are decades ago arguments. Junk DNA, pseudogenes, retroviruses. They've all been thoroughly debunked, as you have done so tonight, Dr. Grady. I had a question based on the so-called hominin fossil record. Hominin meaning your Neanderthals, Erectus, Homo naledi is a newer one. We're talking about genetic entropy, mutation accumulation. Well, in smaller populations, I understand that genetic degeneration is rapid because of inbreeding and those recessive deleterious mutations. They can come to the forefront and degrade essentially. Do you believe, because I've read in a lot of papers recently, that a lot of your so-called hominins, like Neanderthals and Erectus, they were actually genetically very degenerate. They lived in isolation. They were inbred, a lot of mutation accumulation. And so would you argue that a lot of those populations, rather than being evidence for evolution, are just evidence for genetic entropy?
Well, actually, I would argue we now know absolutely and categorically that where there is the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, Erectus, they are all 100% human.
Right.
The idea that Neanderthals were crude, hunchbacked, or whatever, I would point out to you that modern research has shown, and I'm talking about research within the last 15 years, they had religion, they had music, obviously language, but they in fact made jewelry. Yes, they may have lived in caves at times, but we now know that they also constructed houses. Yes, they did have hunting, gathering, but we also now know that they farmed. They did everything that a normal human being does. And we know that their range went all the way from the Atlantic almost to the Pacific. I mean, again, prior to the political situation with Russia, I twice taught in the city of Chita. Chita is east of the Lake Baikal. And that's where the most recent finds of Neanderthal, Denisovans, and so forth was made. So we know that they range all the way from Portugal to Chita, which is almost to the Pacific. They were 100% human. We have recovered DNA from teeth, ear bones, and they share 99.7% the same DNA or more compared to modern humans. Now, I just mentioned that modern humans actually vary by more than that. Today, humans vary by upwards of 4.5% DNA, but Neanderthals only varied by 0.3% or less. And they were absolutely 100% human. They are not some pre-human, some ape becoming human at all. Same thing is true of Erectus. Same thing is true of some of the other names that we could throw out there. Heidelbergensis, for instance. They were absolutely 100% human, and they did everything that humans do today. They were highly intelligent, and I might add, much stronger physically than we are today, showing deterioration. Mentally, they had greater mental capacity. Now, they didn't have all the information we have today available to them, but they were incredibly smart.
Amen. Dr. Grady, so many great points and important points. And so I wanted to show a visual, especially for the audience sake, demonstrating what you're saying is true. And so on the screen, this is the way they used to depict Neanderthals 100 years ago, as you said, as this brutish, half ape, half human creature. And now, to the right, this is how they depict Neanderthal, because we understand Neanderthals, as you put it, were 100% a very sophisticated people group, Dr. Grady.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Some of them certainly did live in caves, as I mentioned. Some of them built houses too. But living in a cave is a very intelligent thing. They're cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and incredibly cheap to build. We had people living in caves on a continuous basis until only a few hundred years ago, and even today, there are times and places where people live in caves. I mean, the last population of people I know of that lived in caves permanently only moved out about 100 years ago. What I'm saying is, name me a time when we didn't have cave people. Well, there's never been a time when we didn't have cave people. If you read the Bible, there's 31 verses talking about how people, even Elijah, King David, and the Apostle Paul, lived in caves at times during their lives.
So many great points. I could go so many different directions. So basically, do you believe that Neanderthals and, let's say, Erectus were a post-flood, maybe post-Babel people group that migrated into Eurasia?
The only reason that there's any concept of them being separate at all is because of the Tower of Babel. If you'll take a look at Genesis chapter 10, verse 3. Genesis chapter 10 is the table of nations created by the separation of the people at the Tower of Babel by 70 languages. So the people were all homogeneous, all one human race until the Tower of Babel. Then God, in judgment, gives them 70 languages, which divides them into small inbreeding populations of 70 groups, each one averaging around 2,000, but it might have been 500 here, 4,000 there. But if you take a look at Genesis 10:3 and you look for the name Ashkenazi, this is the ancient name of northern Europe. It's the ancient name associated with Germany. This is where the Neanderthals were first found in the Neander Valley. And so this is simply one of the 70 people groups that came from the Tower of Babel. They migrated to north central Europe, where living in the cave was a really good idea at the time. And they only lived there for a couple hundred years at most. I mean, when we take a look at the artifacts, the skeletons, etc., of Neanderthals, they only justify living in caves for about a couple hundred years before they established themselves, found out how to live in a new environment, and then not only came out of the caves, but building homes, doing agriculture, and developed Northern European civilization. And so even today, and I have close ties in Israel, but even today, a Jew making Aliyah, the return to the land of Israel from the areas of Germany, are called the Ashkenazi. Northern European Judaism is called Ashkenazi Judaism. Southern European from Spain is Sephardic. And so if you want to say this, and I would, that the Neanderthals are mentioned in the Bible specifically under the Ashkenaz name.
Very good, Dr. Grady. And so with this spreading out or migration after Babel, would you argue that some of these people groups maybe became isolated and over time accumulated more mutations due to inbreeding? I'm just wondering what's the best way from the creationist perspective to explain why some of these people groups genetically were very inbred, very little diversity. If you could speak to that, Dr. Grady, if you had any thoughts.
Well, I think you're calling it by the wrong name. What we have is ethnicity. See, these people groups were separated by language barriers. So no two language groups could mix together because they didn't speak the same language. There were no interpreters. Each group had its own language. And so you get these small inbreeding groups. Yes, that's true, but they are all getting genetic entropy at the same time. What
Right.
we have, though, is that because of the smaller groups, and this is something you can very easily do with genetic studies. It's anybody can do it. In that case, where you have again groups that have maybe 500 here or 4,000 there, and remember, there's only so many men and women and so many children, so you got to take a look at that. But what happens in those groups is not that they generate faster. They don't generate faster. What you do have, however, is the development of ethnicity. And how does that happen? Well, it's not new information. What happens, for instance, is that, and I'm not trying to pick on people groups other than to simply say there are obvious examples. If we go to Africa, Pygmies and Watusis live very close to each other, but they're obviously very different. Now, they're 100% human. No different than a Chihuahua and a Great Dane are both dogs, but they're very different in size and so on. But what happens is in a particular population of the 70 populations, in this particular population, the tall people out-reproduce the short people. And what happens is eventually the genetic information for short people is eliminated, leaving only tall people. In another population, the short people out-reproduce the tall people. And that eliminates the information for tall people, leaving only the information for short people. The same thing happens with noses, straight noses, flat noses, big ears, little ears. Again, this is the same thing with hair, skin tone. All human beings, except albinos, are the same color. The question is only how much of it do you have? And that's ethnicity again. That's in some populations, people that produce more melanin survived and reproduced more than the lighter skinned people, and the lighter skinned people were eliminated. Contrary, the other way around. In some places, the lighter skinned people out reproduced the darker skinned people. But all human beings are the same color, except for albinos, which is a lack of color.
So it's basically pre-existing traits becoming manifest due to environment, situations like you're talking about?
I wouldn't blame environment. That's a misnomer. And secondly, it's not being expressed. It's the opposite word. Again, I want to stress it's elimination.
Okay.
It's elimination. Information for height was not added. Information for shortness was taken away. It's eliminated.
Right. Good point. Good point.
So you must always work with elimination, not added. Excuse me. For example, if you were to take a Heinz 57 dog, just a street mutt, and you wanted to get a Great Dane, which has, of course, very long legs, right? Would you add information for long legs, or would you take away information for short legs?
Right. Take away information for short legs.
You can't add the information for long legs, but you can take away the information for short legs. And the same thing is true in the opposite direction with dachshunds. We take away the long leg information, all you got left is a short leg.
Right.
And sometimes we find that very useful. Dog breeding, for instance, dachshunds and basset hounds to go into burrows need short legs, but powerful. On the other hand, if you want a dog that can run a long way and needs long legs, dachshunds don't help very much. So each of the breeds, what happened? How do you get an Australian sheepdog? How do you get an English sheepdog? How do you get again dachshund, basset hound, poodle? You don't add information to get them. You take away all the information that you need to get whatever you want left. But this is why purebreds are often full of chronic diseases. This is why hip dysplasia in German Shepherds is so common. So what you've done is you've taken very healthy dogs and you've eliminated genetic information. So you've reduced the amount of genetic information they have. Therefore, they're more susceptible to certain diseases, or they suffer from certain chronic conditions because they don't have all the genetic information that's necessary to be a regular dog. And so these, in one sense of the word, and again, I'm not trying to be critical here, but purebreds are defective because we have eliminated information, but we haven't added it.
I appreciate your carefulness in terminology and explaining these concepts. And so if I'm understanding correctly, if as an example, we were to take every single dog today and throw them into Alaska, over time, the information for short hair would be lost, and all you'd be left
Right.
is with dogs with thick,
Short hair
long
dogs.
hair.
And think about this, if I can give you another analogy. There was one pair of bears on the Ark of Noah, and they had all the genetic information to produce all the different kind of bears we have today. Now, God sent bears to the ark, and God would take the pair of bears, because they're unclean, takes the pair of bears that has the least defective, the least loss of genetic information from the original creation 1600 years earlier, right? So the flood is 1656 years after creation. So all life forms have had some deterioration, some loss of genetic information. Hey, Sam. And so what God's going to do is he's going to look for, because he knows the genetic information in the animal. He looks for the male and female bear that has the least genetic loss. He puts them on the ark. And when they come out of the ark, they start to reproduce, because that's what bears do, right? And bears start migrating around the world. So we start with a Heinz 57 bear, and they walk in different directions because bears don't know a thing unless God specifically told the bear to go this way. But some bears go to the Arctic, other bears go to the jungle. The bears that go to the Arctic, because there is an ice age after the flood, but the bears that are black are going to stand out. So the prey can see them and get away from them. And the black bear, it's going to starve to death because he can't get enough food. Think about why are polar bears, one, white? Well, that's pretty obvious. It's camouflage, although actually the hairs are translucent. But why do they have such small ears? If you ever notice, polar bears have a head differently shaped than, say, a grizzly. And why is that? Because the big ears would get frostbite. Frostbite would cause infection. Infection would cause death. And so the bears with big ears get eliminated, and the bears with small ears are going to survive. The bears with dark fur are going to be eliminated, but the lighter color ones are going to survive better. The opposite, say, going down to the Southeast Asian jungle or something like that with fruit bears, moon bears. A white bear is going to stick out like a sore thumb, and so their prey is going to see them and avoid them. So the black bear or brown bear is going to be more camouflaged than the white bear. And so there are the advantages. And again, this is ethnicity in bears. Polar bear is an ethnicity of bears, whereas a black bear or a grizzly, they're just ethnicities. They're varieties of bears, but they're still all bears. And polar bears and grizzly bears will mate. And that's becoming a big problem up in Alaska and Canada, because the polar bear populations are exploding. They are not an endangered species, in spite of what all these, I'm trying to be a polite word, environmental terrorists think. Polar bear populations are growing rapidly, and they're now fighting for territory with grizzlies and brown bears, and they're also causing natural hybrids between the two, because sometimes they don't want to fight, they want to make love.
A lot of great points there, Dr. Grady. Before I comment, our award-winning co-host is here. So speaking of dismantling evolution, Sam loves dismantling evolution. So happy to have you here, brother.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here with you, gentlemen. I was driving home fast, listening the whole way. I almost didn't join because the conversation was
hopefully not too fast.
Not too fast.
Yeah, and your head keeps going in and out of the brick wall behind you.
Yes. Yeah. This topic makes me want to bang my head against the wall sometimes. So I brought the wall.
Yeah, well, and sometimes your ear and your head are kind of melding in with it. But nonetheless, we're glad you're here.
I'm here.
Now we can start, Sam. Dr. Grady and I, we've been sitting here taking it easy on the evolutionists for an hour. But now that you're here, we're going to bring the heat. So in all seriousness, Dr. Grady, excellent points. So basically over time, you mentioned your archetypes, let's say with bears. They come off the ark. They have all the genetic variation necessary to adapt, maybe for lack of a better term. But over time, that information is lost, nothing's gained. So do animals basically hit walls over time? Like a Chihuahua, you're not going to get a Chihuahua back into a wolf. There's too much information that's lost.
Well, the only way you can do that is to very slowly add the information back. So you can't go from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane. It's impossible.
Right.
It also is a very interesting point about the edge of the envelope with genomes. However, to go to your point first, if you want to go from a Chihuahua back to a Heinz 57 dog to a Great Dane, what you have to do is very slowly, generation after generation, add the genetic information from dogs with longer legs, but slowly and gradually adding the information back in until you get all of that long-legged information back. You cannot go straight because the information was eliminated. It's not there. It can't be found.
Right.
Another thing too, though, I want to point out the genetic barriers, the what we call gene pool for most people, but the barrier of the genome. You can only get a dog so small. So we breed poodles, schnauzers, chihuahuas. I mean, all those dogs that you can think of that you get miniatures and then teacups or whatever. But you can only breed a dog just so small, because if you attempt to breed a dog too small, the female in the litter developing with inner womb will literally be torn to shreds because the puppies are too big. And when the female dies, when she literally erupts, the puppies die with her. So there's an edge to the envelope of just how small you can get a dog, because otherwise we could eventually get an invisible dog. Same thing is true with long legs or big animals. So whether we're talking about Great Danes or, since I'm Scottish, Clydesdale horses, okay? Clydesdale is a very familiar breed of horse, but you can take the biggest male and the biggest female Clydesdale in the world, and they will not produce a bigger horse because you already eliminated all of the small information that you can, and the information that's left, you've reached the edge of the envelope. You can't get any bigger. And so there are limits to how far you can stretch the genome. What we have is variation within a kind. It's a lateral shift of genetic information, but there's an edge to the envelope. And you cannot go from one genome to another genome. You can't go from a horse to a cow or a cat to a dog or whatever. Again, the genetic information prevents it from happening. The laws of genetics are not creative, they're conservative.
Dr. Grady,
go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, the example that you gave about reintroducing genetic information into the Chihuahua, for example, someone might say that you can create new traits that way, and they might try to suggest that is an evidence for evolution. How would you respond to that?
But you're not. Remember that DNA is structural, and so you can breed dogs. You can breed a really good sheep dog. You can a really good guard dog. And again, I'm not being hard on anybody, but some dog varieties are pretty dumb, frankly. Others are very, very smart. But this is the breeder who has eliminated information to get whatever they want. They have a color, they have a certain stature, and sometimes it's still physical. After all, when they have a Doberman pincer, they still cut off the tail to get what they want. It's a mechanical thing.
Yeah, they would still have to find pre-existing genetic information that was from that original created kind to reintroduce into the Chihuahua. They couldn't just pull a bear out of the woods.
No, they can't do that. They've got to get a dog, and they've got to get a dog that's only slightly bigger,
right?
Which theoretically has some information for slightly longer legs, and you have to add it for generations. It takes 8 generations pretty much to even get back to the middle, back to the norm. So again, it takes 8 generations to get any characteristics that you're intentionally breeding for. And remember, while you're breeding for it, you get there by eliminating the other.
Yes, and it seems like you would still have that mutation accumulation that you guys were talking
Yeah,
about
it's
earlier.
still everything's going downhill.
That's right.
It doesn't
Yeah,
really matter. You may add the information, but both the dogs, the smaller and larger, are still both going through the process of genetic entropy.
right.
So if I could, we oftentimes speak of created kinds, changes within a kind, variation within a kind. The evolutionists will then ask, Sam, you've heard it a million times as well. Well, what's the limit of change within a kind? Is it basically what you're talking about as to how variations within a kind hit barriers? They'll hit a wall because so much information is lost.
The gene pool is like a swimming pool. It's got an edge. And you can go up to the edge, but you can't go over it. Because the information that would change one kind to another isn't there to start with. So you can't.
Is there a way to identify that edge?
Well, of course, in breeding experiments, we've reached the edge in a lot of places.
Yeah.
But have we reached it with everything? No, because we've never tried it with everything. But every one of them does. But experimentally, once you find out that 1,000 things have an edge, they all have an edge. Humans cannot become superhumans. We're in fact deteriorating. We're becoming less and less, not less human, but we are becoming less and less genetically diverse because of the destruction of information. And so over time, we are literally becoming less intelligent, less strong. The only reason that humans are different than animals, because we're not animals. And I want to stress that. We have a spirit, they don't. We live in a biological body similar to certain animals, that's true, but we have a spirit that makes us totally unique to begin with. But there is no way you can go from us to an ape, or, as a matter of fact, kind of interesting, some evolutionists said that the decay of humans was producing apes. But the fact of the matter is, you can't get to an ape from us. You can't get us from an Australopithecine. You can't get us from a monkey, etc. Because the genetic information is not there that would allow that to happen. They have a certain amount of information within the genome. You can stretch the genome in every way to get to the edge, but once you hit that edge, you can't go further because there's no information to be added to it. You can't get bigger, better, faster, smarter. Humans don't know how to make ourselves better to start with, even though there are many who think they can.
I think that's an excellent answer to that question posed by the evolutionists. I'd like to ask you, going back to the so-called hominin fossil record, which Dr. Grady, you and I agree represent humans. I mean, Neanderthals, we have their genetics. We know that we interbred with them. The species definition, if we can interbreed, and produce offspring, it's the same species.
Well, again, 10 years ago, I want to stress this, 2013, 5 of the supposed intermediates leading from the Australopithecines to people, which is the Australopithecines are a poor choice for people anyway. Saying apes was a much better choice because the Australopithecines have unique skeletal structures that wouldn't make a good human to begin with. But 5 of these intermediates, which evolutionists like to talk about, such again as Heidelbergensis, and well, they were all, including Erectus, reclassified as Erectus because they want to try to make them not human. But in one day, they took 5 of these different creatures and said, no, they're just variations within a kind. They are all one group. They are not different. And that's just it. Evolutionists, they will dig up one skull, one jaw, even one tooth, and invent an entire species out of it because that's the way they make a living. They write it up and invent something new. When the fact of the matter is, when you take a look at all of these skulls that are attributed to Erectus or Heidelbergensis or Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, and humans, they are all variations within one kind. You can find people today with very slanted foreheads, with very heavy eyebrows, etc., but they're still a human. They didn't come from apes. That's just genetic information inherited from their predecessor humans. And the information was always there from the time of the creation. It didn't come into existence by random chance.
Yeah, you'd think that would be such a glaring problem for them, because these alleged transitionals, those are supposed to represent the majority of the time that we've been evolving for millions and millions of years. So you would think you wouldn't be able to put a shovel in the ground without finding some evidence. But where is it?
Well, again, it's a good time to go back and teach this from the beginning. The two most important questions in science, above all else, in every scientific field, no matter what it is, what's there? When I make a scientific observation, I must be able to accurately describe what is present. But the more important question is what's not there? What's not there? And we learn more by asking that question than the first. Now, your question, Sam, and I'm going to rephrase it slightly differently, but it's the same question. If humans are supposed to have been evolving for 500,000 to 1 million years from some supposed predecessor, where is the evidence? Where are the skeletons? Where are the tools? Where are the artifacts? And all we can find is just enough to fill 100 or 200 years. I mean, where are all those things that ought to be there? Now, we do occasionally find them. We do occasionally find a human bone or a human tool or whatever that's pre-flood. But almost everything we find is post-flood, and very obviously so. And that these are different people groups coming from the Tower of Babel when it comes to humans. But the fact of the matter is we have found pre-flood tools, etc. And I have another great question. I've been in Israel twice this year helping to lead tours, and I love going over there and showing the evidence for where the flood began, etc. But in looking at the evidence, for instance, if these mountains are supposed to have eroded, where's the material that eroded down? Because when you go in the Jordan Valley, you can clearly see the erosion product on both sides of the valley, and it's only a few thousand years of erosion product. It's not millions and billions of years. Where are the bones from the supposed evolution? Because do some simple math. If you believed in 1 million years, which I do not accept at all, I mean, I used to teach it, but I don't believe in it at all. I believe that everything's basically 6,000 years old for good scientific reasons. But take 1 million years, if we're supposed to be evolving from these creatures, how long is a generation? Now, today we think of a generation 20, 25, 30. You can find some different values in the Bible, 30, 40. One can find a reference that would say it's 120, but you have to understand what that reference is about. However, let's just say a generation is 40. Now, today that would be very generous. I mean, today a generation is 20. How many of us know grandmothers when they're 20 years old? Kind of thing. Yeah. So by the time they're 40, they've got 20-year-old children. 30, some of them have children that are already teenagers, right? So, I mean, 20 is a generation these days. Well, let's say 40, just to be incredibly generous. So people don't have babies until they're 40. Well, in 1 million years, how many generations is that?
A lot.
Come on, you can do better than that.
That's my math on the fly.
Come on, let's do some math on the fly here. 1 million divided by 40.
Well, I think it would be a couple 100,000.
Well, how about 25,000? So,
yeah.
1 million divided by 40. Take off 1 0. That's 100,000 divided by 4. So that's 25,000, right? Again, where's the evidence? Where's the bones? Where's the artifacts? Where's the foundation of buildings? Where are the stones and stuff like that? Next question that I love asking in Israel, because all of the guides in Israel that were trained by evolutionists say, well, this is Iron Age 1. This is Iron Age 2. This is Bronze Age 1. This is Bronze Age 2. And then they talk about the Stone Age, Paleolithic. And I have a question. When has there ever been a time on this earth that humans did not use stone tools? We still use stone tools today. We sharpen steel with stone. We grind, various meal products with stone. We cut pavement with stone. When has there ever been a time that people didn't use stone tools? And the answer is there's never been a time when people. So you can't say it's Stone Age and date anything using that kind of terminology. They're dating it using an evolutionary assumption that it's millions and billions of years old. But that's just their religion. It's not science. And so, as you say, where is the evidence? We have found various stone tools in pre-flood materials. We find stone tools in California in layers dated by evolutionists at 55 million plus years. We find a metal bell in West Virginia in a coal seam. We find artifacts like that all over the world. Now, they may be rare, but we find them. And, out, if you take a look far enough, the Nampa doll out in Nampa, Idaho, is an obvious fired clay human figurine found in a layer 12 million years old, according to evolutionists, but shouldn't exist there. And while some of them want to say, well, the earth cracked open and something fell in and the earth closed back up again. Well, first of all, it's undamaged. And I think if that were the case, it would be damaged. But it's just their silly fairy tale to try to cover up the falsity of their position.
Right. Dr. Grady, if I could, firstly, a few points you made earlier about variation within a kind, whether it's erectus, heidelbergensis, whether it's Neanderthals. I'd even throw some of the newer examples like Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi in there. But a lot of paleoanthropologists, they have verified your point. There's a lot that would be considered lumpers where they've realized, you know what, this is all variation within the Homo sapiens group.
You can't find one skull and say everybody had the same skull shape. It's simply not true. You could look at a million sheep and their skulls are not all identical.
Right. They will create an entire transitional form, Dr. Grady, based on a single skull cap or based on a single jawbone or tooth.
Well, Mary Lee invented Ramidus based on a piece of jaw with 4 teeth. Yeah. And created a whole new pre-human. Why? Because she's an evolutionist. She makes her money finding something and then blowing it up far beyond what it could support.
I think it was Nebraska Man that was based off of a single pig tooth, if I remember correctly.
Well, Nebraska Man never existed. Let's get that straight. It was a pig. But initially, and that's one of those areas where there's 4 basic proof categories that evolutionists use when they try to point out that people evolved from apes and prove it to some people who are gullible and not knowledgeable. And that, of course, we deal with hoaxes such as Piltdown Man. Then you deal with misrepresentations such as Nebraska Man. And then you deal with the category of the bones of dead apes, such as the Australopithecines, and the bones of dead people. Well, hoaxes are hoaxes, and once we find out about them, of course, those are tossed out. Misrepresentations such as Nebraska Man's tooth, which turned out to be that of a pig, this is where science is supposed to be self-correcting, and it's an example of that. But once you understand what misrepresentations are, you can't count them either. So you throw out hoaxes, you throw out misrepresentations. You have nothing but the bones of dead apes and the bones of dead people, but you have no transitions that are provable.
They knew what Nebraska Man's wife and kids looked like based on that single pig tooth. That's amazing.
Well, there was an artist in the London Illustrated Times who drew that, who drew what Nebraska Man looked like, and his friend or wife. I've never figured that one out. His horses, his camels, and the club he was carrying, all from one tooth that turned out to be that of a pig.
Whoops. So my question is, Sam, and then we'll hand it to you because I've been curious. With all of this established and so many great points, Dr. Grady, when it comes to a human like Erectus? How, as creationists, do we best explain some of their differing features, like the
But again, it's
sloping
just variation
foreheads?
of kind. Again, it's population groups.
Mm,
Remember that when you find something that's pre-flood, it was one large, pretty much homogeneous population.
right.
Then only 8 survived. Now, those 8 had as near perfect human genetic information as possible, because God, again, is going to choose those that had the least destruction of genetic information. After the flood, they start reproducing. The Tower of Babel is approximately 150 years after the flood. We don't have an exact date, but using conservative demographics, we would expect about 140,000 people to be alive at the time of the Tower of Babel. They are then divided by languages into 70 inbreeding groups, as you have mentioned more than once. But what happens from there is just ethnic differences. So whether it's Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, whether it's Heidelbergensis, these are just variations within people groups. So again, Neanderthals come from the Ashkenazi. The Ashkenazi coming from the Tower of Babel, again, Genesis 10:3, going to North Central Europe and establishing a people group, an ethnicity there that look very different from the people who, say, went to China.
Right.
And if you take a look at Genesis chapter 10, and if you take a look at outside histories, outside of the Bible, we know exactly where all 70 people groups went.
So basically, when we see, let's say, a human like Erectus, where you see the reduced chin, would you argue that originally humans would have had a larger chin, but in that specific people group, the information for a larger chin was mostly lost? Or
yes, again, it's a loss and an elimination of information. But you touched on something I like to point out. Ever had your eye teeth pulled? That is to say, your wisdom teeth.
you know what? I lucked out and never had to get them pulled.
I did.
But
I did. Now tell me, why are we having to pay a dentist to eliminate the wisdom teeth, as they're called? But why?
yeah,
It's
our
like the
jaws
jaw
were larger, maybe.
order. Yeah.
Well, see, we're getting smaller, slower, and dumber.
Great
Our
point.
jaws are not as big as they used to be. So they're having to pull out the wisdom teeth because there's no longer the room that there was initially when people were, in fact, bigger. I mean, I don't know. I'm only saying this to a degree of speculation, but we know that people can genetically in the past grow to be 10 foot tall. Referred to basically as giants. But again, there are various giants mentioned. King Og. Most people are familiar with David's battle with Goliath. Now, these were people, even the time of David, who are going to be 7, 8 feet tall, maybe 9. But look up the life of Robert Wadlow, born 1920, Alton, Illinois, died in 1942. He was 8 foot 11.1 inches tall. That's close enough to 9 feet for me. So if a guy can grow to be 9 foot tall, and let's face it, he died in 1942. So I was born in 46. So 80 years ago. Then certainly Goliath could grow to be 9 foot tall. King Og could grow to be 10 foot tall. Before the flood, we don't know how tall, but it is perfectly reasonable to believe that Adam might have been 7 foot, 8 foot. Eve might have been 7 foot. After all, the world's tallest woman died in modern time. Died in Tennessee only a few years ago. She was almost 7.5 feet tall. So there's no reason to say that Adam and Eve might have been 7, 8 foot tall, passed on the genetic information for both people who would become smaller by elimination of information and even taller than them, because people did get taller than that. We again know of 9 footers, maybe 10 footers. But again, there are physical problems with people that get to be that big. Robert Wadlow had to walk with 2 canes because he was very awkward. Gravity pulled blood into his legs. He had a real problem and unfortunately died from an infection.
Dr. Grady, excellent points on human evolution. They're important points. That almost deserves its own clip. And so I appreciate it. What are your thoughts on evolutionists that'll look to, you've mentioned the Australopithecines several times, Lucy being the famous one, Afarensis. They'll look to the shape and form of their pelvis and argue that these were upright walking apes. Can you speak to that a bit, Dr. Grady?
Donny, excuse me. I'm getting a little dry here. I'll have to have a little drink. Forgive me.
Yeah. Take your time. Well deserved, brother.
Wonder what a big drink looks like.
Well, you know, Diet Coke is God's gift to prove He loves us. I've gotten off the subject. I'm sorry.
Laughter's the best medicine. It's good to get a little
indeed.
of that every now and then.
It is indeed. But we were making points about Australopithecines. And Donnie, did you ever see the video? I have to believe you did. Did you ever see the video where this anthropologist took a cast of Lucy and took a bandsaw, cuts it, reglues it back together, and says, "This is the way it must have been originally."
Oh yeah.
You know, when Lucy was first found, there was an argument as to whether it was male or female based on the fact that we only had half a pelvis and it had been deformed in preservation. Initially, it was said to be Lucy and a female, but a lot of evolutionists believe it was actually a male. And like I said, some of them even fabricated evidence. But clearly, this was nothing but an ape. Now, did it walk upright? Well, first of all, if you take a look at all the research that has been done, there are curved finger bones, curved foot bones, and an arboreal ape in Lucy's skeleton. And we have found the absolutely perfect fossil of a human metatarsal bone in the same layer as Lucy fossils. And that would be a pre-flood human being who died in the flood and was buried in the same layers. Proving, of course, that Australopithecines didn't come from something else, and they didn't create people either, because we find their bones together. I mean, there's lots of arguments that you can have here.
And
again,
footprints too, like the Laetoli foot.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's some great. I mean, we find human artifacts, human bones, human footprints, like the Laetoli footprints, in the same layers and areas as Lucy.
Those were found by Mary Leakey, again, who discovered Romulus. And they said, oh, well, how could this be? Because this is 3.5 million supposed years old. And we know that humans didn't exist at that time, according to our religion. So how could this be? Well, there must have been an ape that had a human-like foot. You know, it's fairy tales for adults to try to get over and away from the actual analysis of the evidence, which proves that Australopithecines and humans lived at the same time. They were created at the same time by the same creator God.
Amen. And
That's right.
I wanted to point out, because a lot of evolutionists, they'll say, oh, you know, this is just creationist based arguments. But as you've pointed out, in the paleoanthropological community, a lot of your evolutionists are the ones discovering this. For example, with Australopithecus sediba, Lee Berger, he was promoting sediba as just your best transitional form. And they've recently discovered that sediba is actually artificial and comprises bones from humans, the Homo genus, and ape or Australopithecine bones.
Well, see, again, this is where we get into the misrepresentation part. The bones are real. This is not a hoax, but it's a mixture of bones that were then used to create a misrepresentation. But the more we know, the more we realize it's that, and therefore it's not evidence for evolution at all. It's evidence for creation.
Amen. Well said. Okay, I better sneak some of these audience questions in here. Dr. Grady, Sam and I could talk to you all day and ask you questions all day because you always give the best answers. So
I'm bless your heart and all your other parts.
God bless you too, brother. Okay, so Apologetics 101. Question for Dr. Grady. What would you consider to be the strongest evidence against evolution?
Well, the one word entropy is the one that is universal. and genetic entropy specifically would be number 2. But there's a ton of others. For instance, the decay of the Earth's magnetic field is irrefutable, proving that the Earth is less than 8,000 years old. So, I mean, it doesn't matter where you look, whether it's biology, whether it's paleontology, geology, astronomy. We have today, my personal favorite. I mean, you said, what's the strongest one? Well, I named you the strongest. But my personal favorite is the study of the geochronometers. On my website at creationworldview.org, there's a place that says free videos, and under free videos, there's a section of Did You Know? And by the way, in the fall, we will be adding another 90, but we are continuing to add these weekly. Today, we're up to almost 400, and almost all of those deal with some geochronometer, some scientific argument that the Earth and the universe are young. Doesn't matter whether it's lumpy rings around planets, barred spiral galaxies, the moon's too hot. All of those things are there. So I can say that when I first started teaching on creation, we had about 250. Today, I have nearly 400. And we keep adding them. And when we add another 90 on the website later in the year, we're going to be upwards of nearly 500 specific small ones, and also some of the larger ones, showing scientifically that the Earth, the solar system, the galaxy, the universe are only 6,000 years old.
It's a great time to be a biblical creationist, Dr. Grady. That is a lot of amazing evidence.
I believe on your YouTube channel, you also have that playlist. Did you know?
Well, that's just it. You see, you can get to it through our website, but they're stored on YouTube. So we have a YouTube channel. You can go direct to YouTube, or you can go through our website, either one. We'd ask you to sign up, just like you would ask people to sign up. It's free.
That's right.
And it's a great place to go if you've got insomnia. When you got 400 of them, you play the first one, they just keep going until you stop.
Right. Never ending evidence for young Earth creation.
That's right.
Nothing better than that. So I've got your links there to your website and
appreciate that
YouTube channel. So here's a question. This is a hot topic these days, and I hope I didn't lose it in the chat because chat is lively. Okay, I got it right here. So we were kind of talking about this before, Dr. Grady. The claim that Jurassic Park makes that modern birds evolved from dinosaurs, and they'll even say taxonomically that birds today, Dr. Grady, are dinosaurs. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love that. They believe that birds evolved from the lizard hip, not from the bird hip dinosaurs. I'm sorry, I always get a big kick out of that one.
Right.
But it's impossible, and we can prove it. After all, feathers and scales develop from different portions of the epidermis. They don't come from the same layer whatsoever. We have the flow-through lung of birds is not the flow-through lung of dinosaurs. They don't have that. You have the different chambered hearts, 3-chambered heart versus 4-chambered heart. There is no way in the world that you can get from a reptile to a bird by evolution. And even the greatest of evolutionary believing ornithologists admit you cannot get from a reptile to a bird. They may believe that they evolved from something else, but that they couldn't have come from the reptiles. The only evidence they use are things like, well, they both have hollow bones.
Right.
Well, yeah, so what? They both have hollow bones. They were both designed with hollow bones. Birds need it for the purposes of flight to stay lightweight. And you also have to remember the hollow bones are very strong. I would, if you don't mind, go to the biblical side for a second.
Sure.
Clearly, there are 12 references to dinosaurs or their relatives as people would think of them. I mean, leviathans are large aquatic marine reptiles. They're not dinosaurs by definition, but people think of them as relatives to dinosaurs. But there's 12 references to dinosaurs or their relatives. Now, when you go to Job chapter 40, verse 15, 16, 17, 18, God is clearly describing a large land-dwelling dinosaur of some kind, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, something of that nature. And he creates them on day 6. If you go to Genesis chapter 1, the translation of the beasts of the field or the beasts of the earth is a direct reference to the creation of dinosaurs on day 6, the same day as people, correct? You go to Genesis chapter 1, verses 29 and 30. God says he created all creatures as vegetarians initially. Now, how great is a God who can create us to be vegetarians initially, but in his foreknowledge know that later in Genesis 9:3, he will say, now you will also have to eat meat and give us a metabolism and the enzymes and so forth to be able to eat meat, even though originally we were vegetarians. When you go to Job chapter 40, 15, 16, 17, 15 says, behold, Behemoth. Now that's a Hebrew word, it's not English. It means beast of beasts. I made him along with you on day 6, the week of creation. He eats grass like an ox. He's a vegetarian, correct? That's consistent with Genesis chapter 1. Then, verse 16, this is a big, strong, powerful animal. Verse 17, a tail the size of a cedar tree, not a twig, which is a dinosaur. But in verse 18, it says he has bones that are like tubes of bronze and bars of iron. People think of that as a poetic statement being made by Job, dealing with God's creation. However, it is God speaking. Job's only quoting him. But think about that for a second. Tubes of bronze and bars of iron. Reptile bones are hollow. This was a scientific statement. The bones of reptiles are tubes. And that's because they are very strong, though lightweight. And reptiles need that because reptiles, having 3-chambered hearts, can sprint very quickly for a very short distance, but they have no stamina whatsoever. Their hearts and their lungs don't allow them to. So if they're going to move fast, they need to be lightweight for the short distances where they are fast. But after that, you can outrun an alligator easily if you just veer a little one way or the other. So pointing out that this is a good design and mentioned in the Bible accurately.
I agree. Dr. Grady, what would you say to someone who said that they have evidence of feathered dinosaurs?
They don't. There's absolutely no evidence of feathered dinosaurs whatsoever. This is another one of those fairy tales for adults. Now, what we have found are some fossils of some dinosaurs that have fibrils, but these are actually part of the skin. They are not feathers. We have never found a dinosaur with feathers, in spite of all of the propaganda, including the third Jurassic Park movie, which was very blatant. But the fact of the matter is, we have never found a feathered dinosaur. Now, reptiles have claws, and they have hollow bones, but that doesn't mean they evolved into birds. And when we take a look again at the hearts, the lungs, where the scales and feathers come from, and people fail to realize what a terrifically complex design feathers are. This is not something that could come about by random chance.
And to support your point further, Dr. Grady, they've discovered similar structures that they find on so-called feathered dinosaurs on dolphin carcasses, ichthyosaur carcasses, shark carcasses. And we would all agree sharks don't have feathers.
Well, again, these are fibrils that are in the skin.
Right.
Sometimes, under very rare conditions, which requires perfect flood burial, we will find these little fibrils and so forth. But again, they are not feathers. This is an absolute, complete deception of evolutionists to say that they are.
I've heard some say that because the structures, at least on some so-called feathered dinosaurs, are associated with beta keratin, and so they must be feathers, is what they'll assert. What's a good response to that, Dr. Grady?
Beta keratin is vitamin A. It's an oil. So I think maybe that argument doesn't hold up. But the fact of the matter is, we find the same molecules in many different creatures, which again proves a common designer, creator,
right.
God. We find the same molecule being used now, keratin. So beta keratin is a vitamin. That's an oil. It's vitamin A. But keratin is a protein product that is in human fingernails. It's in bear claws. It's in eagle beaks. It's the exoskeleton of insects. It is an incredibly useful protein, and God used it to design and create many, many different creatures. But that's not something we inherited from a common ancestor.
Yeah, I believe it's also in some skin pigments, if I'm not mistaken, also.
Oh, you'll find it in many things. In pigments, for instance, it helps in preservation of the color.
Yeah.
Right. So why does it have to necessarily mean feathers? It seems to be a weak argument. It could be reptile skin. From my understanding, beta keratin's found in reptiles.
Well, again, I would just stop with keratin, and it's a different spelling. But nonetheless, it's a very ubiquitous molecule because it is so useful in so many different ways.
Right. So here's a question based on something you were speaking to earlier, Dr. Grady, with the post-flood. Essentially, the question is, how can we tell that which is post-flood and that which is pre-flood?
Typically, it's because of the position burial. If something was buried in a flood after the flood of Noah, it's going to be relatively shallow. Although, of course, with landslides, it could be deeper. Material that is pre-flood is going to be found in sedimentary layers, generally very well preserved if it's good fossilization. And there are many other aspects to it, but the pre-flood, post-flood is pretty easy to tell. Again, these multiple, sometimes thousands and thousands of layers, often very fine gradation. And you're not going to find pre-flood materials in volcanic materials because the volcanoes are going to bury things after the flood. Now, there were thousands of volcanoes that went off at the time of the flood, but the waters would wash away the effect there and the erosion of the continents. And so the waters have to go away before you're going to get volcanic sedimentation. You find that out in Kansas, for a matter of fact. When you find rhinoceros and other creatures that are buried in volcanic ash. So there's a few things like that. Now, evolutionists like to use volcanic ash to separate some layers, like you mentioned Lucy. Originally, when she was found, he was found, it was found. According to evolutionary dating, because of an ash layer above the bones that were fossilized, it was dated at 12 to 16 million years old. But Leakey said, oh, that's too old. It can't possibly be that old. And so finally, they kept dating it until they found a date they liked and threw the rest away. And that allowed him to say, oh, this is only, 3.5 million years old. See, evolutionists are terribly deceptive. And they get a lot of information, but they only keep what makes them look good. They never show you what proves they're wrong.
So I guess my follow-up question is, as you probably know, there's a lot of in-house debate over where the post-flood boundary is located within the young Earth creation community. Do you have an opinion on that, Dr. Grady?
Well, there is a lot of debate, and I want to make sure that that's well known. However, I think that we can certainly say, for instance, the Cretaceous up is post-flood, no question about that.
Right.
Exactly where you draw the line prior to that is still debated amongst creationists, and that's healthy. After all, we weren't there. We didn't actually see it. But certainly prior to the Cretaceous, for sure.
As you were putting it, these strata are not, it's not shallow. It's pancake layers, basically, one after another, that only catastrophic processes could explain, obviously, a flood.
Well, and again, when you find the layers folded, when you find them upside down, that's from the flood. When you find them folded, that has to be because these are the wet mud layers of the flood, folded by the tectonic forces from the flood. And so folded layers are going to tell you, for the most part, that's pre-flood. Polystrate fossils are going to tell you pretty much it's pre-flood. But then again, you have to remember that except for a single-celled organism, almost all fossils are polystrate to begin with by definition. So you can't really hold on to that one. So again, we're looking at the boundary of post-flood, pre-flood, certainly before the Cretaceous. I don't think there's any argument about that. But exactly where you put it is still being debated. And I just want to openly say that's the case.
Right.
I mean, there's arguments for this layer or that layer, but we're still working on it. Now, that simply does mean that in the future, we may well find the evidence to prove exactly where it is.
Right. Usually it's a debate between either the KT boundary or the late Cenozoic, a higher flood boundary, which is what I more so hold to.
Yeah, I tend to say late Cenozoic myself, but the KT layer is not relevant. KT layer is no way to separate this because the KT layer, there's too many flaws in that kind of thinking. We have found dinosaur fossils above the KT layer.
Right.
So, the KT layer is not continuous. We have found dinosaur fossils above it, which would tend to indicate, therefore, that the boundary of pre and post was above the KT layer.
Right.
So I would not use that one. Okay.
Agreed. I agree with you on that one. We've had Michael J. Ord on for a series focusing on the flood boundary, and he provided some pretty overwhelming evidence for a late Cenozoic flood boundary.
Yeah, and if you're going to push me, then I'll simply say I tend to agree.
Yeah.
But I don't think we can say it absolutely at this point.
Right. Right. So, Dr. Grady, as we were you going to say something, Dr. Grady?
It's 8:00 and
right.
I got to go.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No problem. Right here is the last question. It came in the form of a donation. So if we get you to answer this one, and then that's the 2-hour mark, we're going to wrap it up, Dr. Grady. So 2 hours flies by with you, and I appreciate it. So this is from Eric Peterson. We can narrow this down to one because we could be here for another hour. He's saying, thank you, SFT and Dr. Grady. He enjoyed the show. We're glad you enjoyed it, Eric. A lot of positive feedback, Dr. Grady. So he's saying, what are your current top 5? Why don't we just say 1 arguments or facts against an old Earth? Earlier, you said magnetic field. So if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
We got roughly 400 to 500 geochronometers that all prove it's young. There's some that are probably in the top 10. And personally, I think the decay of the Earth's magnetic field is the number 1. But if it's not number 1, it's in the top 10. Okay. However, again, genetic entropy has got to be included. Entropy in general has got to be included in the top 5. So, the laws of thermodynamics, the first one proves that the universe could not have evolved into existence. The second says that everything goes downhill. It had to start perfect and become imperfect afterwards. So I think I've mentioned 5 there that could easily be considered in the top 5.
Well, Dr. Grady, as always, I appreciate your time. You give us 2 hours every time, and it flies by. So I look forward to where we can do this again in the future. Did you have any final words, my brother, Dr. Grady?
Well, obviously, Standing for Truth has a lot of good material. And again, at creationworldview.org, we have a ton of free articles. Very few are real technical. They're clearly labeled. The rest are all at the popular level. We have, again, a free section of short videos, lots of material there that you can mine for free. And we have a bookstore, just like other creation sites. I have 27 videos of my own. I've got 2 books that I've written. And we are adding materials all the time. So just come on down and find something that's of interest to you.
Amen. You've been a huge blessing to this ministry, but just to the creation, evolution, debate in general. And again, I want to thank you for doing this, Dr. Grady. To the audience, please check the description box. I do have all the relevant links to Dr. Grady's websites and also his YouTube channel. So please check that out. Give him a subscription. Sam, thank you for joining for this final hour, brother. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, sir. Good to see all of you.
God bless all.
Thank you.